Hello, morning. You're watching Sky News Breakfast. Israel launches airstrikes on the West Bank and warns anyone living in northern Gaza to move south immediately. The world of football pays tribute to England legend Sir Bobby Charlton, who has died at the age of 86. Ukraine says 6 people have been killed following a Russian missile strike, this time on a postal distribution centre. And in a moment we'll discuss the papers with broadcaster and writer Gemma Forte and Shona Craven, community editor and columnist for The National. But first, let's take you through some of the front pages now. And our hero, the Daily Star, leads with a tribute to Sir Bobby Charlton. And as the Sunday People also have their headline, Forever a Hero, we will never forget him, nor will football. The Mirror quotes Sir Geoff Hurst. And a tribute by David Beckham on the front page of The Sun, calling him a hero to many around the world. Meanwhile, The Observer leads on the Middle East. It says the US is holding the Israeli government back from launching a preemptive strike on Hezbollah in Lebanon over fears of a two-front war which could reignite a major regional conflict. And the Mail says Israel has vowed to cut off the head of the snake and launch a military attack against Iran if Tehran-backed terror group Hezbollah joins the war. And the Sunday Telegraph says the US is calling on Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to designate Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organisation in the wake of what it calls complicity in the Hamas attack. And the Times says Hamas fugitive who ran the group's terror operations in the West Bank lives in a council house in London. And the Express says security sources have warned Islamic extremists are attempting to recruit protesters at pro-Palestinian rallies. So lots to get through there. And as I said, we're joined by a broadcaster and writer, Gemma Forte, and Shona Craven, community editor and columnist for The National. So much to get through. Thanks so much for joining me here at Sky News. So let's start with Sir Bobby Charlton, because it does dominate some of the papers this morning. Such a legend, such a gentleman, and The Sun going with the headline, a hero to the whole world.
Absolutely. So as you say, the papers are sort of dominated by the conflict and the war, and then this sort of celebration, if you like, of a life that was really quite extraordinary. So a very different tone. So we know he won the World Cup. We'll never forget that. But of course, he was also a complete legend for Man United, the club that he loved so much. And interesting to learn so much more about his life. I think most people knew that he had survived the Munich air crash. And reading more detail about that, I was just reminded of the sort of survivor guilt that he spoke of later on in his life. What a huge thing to get over, and the sort of the detail about how when he came round in the hospital he had to go through this very traumatic experience of somebody reading out the names of his teammates and him discovering in that way with a simple yes or no who had made it. What a thing to go through. But as you say as well, there isn't anything to say about, apart from lovely things about this man. He was clearly a very, very good man, a very, very kind man, a very, very nice person. And that counts for so much, apart from his extraordinary achievements on the football pitch.
Oh, completely. And I think the Munich air disaster would have shaped him to be the man that he became in those later years. But then on the global stage, Shona, he was known around the world, wasn't he? And the Mirror sort of really encapsulating that, saying we'll never forget him and nor will football. And that's the world of football, the community of football.
Yeah, and I think what does come across is this sportsmanship and integrity, and the fact that, you know, perhaps if we look at some of the players, football players today who maybe have a lot of successes, they don't necessarily have that reputation as a gentleman, as someone that younger players can look up to, and maybe his formative experiences account for that.
What's interesting is when Manchester United, because he went on, like Gemma said, to be a director with Manchester United. When Manchester United won the treble in 1999, he was quoted as saying he felt what paradise was like when that final goal was scored, I think by Teddy Sheringham at the time. But he loved the club and he embodied the club, didn't he?
Absolutely. And I know obviously Shona, you're Scottish, but for anybody English, you know, will we ever win the World Cup ever again, and it's a shame that he didn't get to see that in his lifetime. And extraordinary when you think he was born in 1937, so before the last Second World War, and very interesting to see how the world has changed, you know, at the time of his death and the kind of global conflict. I don't know, it's just something interesting to think about.
And I don't think there'd be another footballer, I don't know what you think, that would have such prominence across all of the newspapers, even those that go with other front pages.
Yeah, I know Twitter isn't everything, but, you know, or X, whatever it's called now, but it lit up like a Christmas tree last night, and just with so much love, with such an outpouring from people who had met him, who had, you know, experienced what he was like as a human. And it just, you can just tell, this isn't disingenuous, this isn't insincere, they really loved him. Not one bad word to say across the board. He was just a lovely man. I love the picture, the photograph on the front of the Mirror. When you see the pictures that would have been taken in black and white, and they're brought to life, and we can now see what they look like in colour. And it's just a brilliant piece of photography, apart from anything else, just really encapsulating the power of that kick. It's fabulous.
Yeah, it's a beautiful picture. Let's move on now, because there is another big story dominating the papers, and that is the Middle East. And when we talk about game changers in this conflict, the Observer going with how the US are holding back Israel from this strike potentially against Hezbollah. That's going to be worrying, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, there's a bit of a contrast actually between the Observer front talking about the US trying to restrain Israel here, but then on the Mail on Sunday, we've got Israel, we will strike head of the snake, Iran, suggesting that you know, Iran can't sit back and fund this chaos and fund this action without being concerned for its own citizens. But you do have to question how many different fronts this can be fought on.
I think bringing to light as well that the US still have this considerable, you know, heft, and that Biden is playing a crucial role in what has become ever increasingly a complete diplomatic quagmire. I think that his focus in terms of international foreign policy, whatever, hasn't been the Middle East for a long time, and then obviously it certainly is now. And it's, you know, very scary when you think 9/11, 7/7, and now the 7th of October. These are dates that we'll never forget for obvious reasons, horrific terrorist attacks. But looking at the wider picture, I think Biden is reported to have said to Israel, don't make the mistakes that the US did. You know, when you're vengeful, when you're angry, you have to look at the wider ramifications. And then this is what we're seeing now, is it's volatile, and the other Arab states, right, so Egypt and Jordan, very against, obviously, the attacks that Hamas committed. But now there's that question, and nobody can independently verify who bombed the hospital. That's become really complicated, and they then snubbed Biden, and this is where it gets delicate. You've got Hezbollah suddenly looking rather volatile, and if that escalates, then at what point do the US have to make decisions about getting involved? And that's really terrifying. And then, of course, from a humanitarian point of view, just the loss of life on all fronts, and the lack of enough aid getting in. I know that the hospitals in Gaza are now running out of, you know, you hear these little details, bandages for burns.
And certainly Biden stating and talking, Shona, to the American people, saying we have a vested interest to help facilitate peace in the Middle East, because what happens in Jerusalem, what happens in Ukraine will have a direct impact on the American people, on people around the world.
Yeah, and it's a very difficult balance to strike, because nobody wants to see this spread. Nobody wants the whole of the Middle East to erupt. But at the same time, Israel, obviously, very strong words. You know, there are these rockets being fired across the border from Lebanon, and at what point does that escalate? At what point do those funding the action have to bear some responsibility? But at the same time, it is a sort of a bit of a do as we say, not as we've done from the US, which of course has its own interests, and Rishi Sunak, talking about wanting to stop a contagion of conflict in the region. But they're walking this very fine line, and every day, as you say, we're hearing more horrendous details. I think one of the details was about premature babies in hospital, and whether it's power, whether it's the supplies they need. I mean, it just doesn't bear thinking about at all.
2 hostages released. That's something, but you've still got a couple of hundred people in those tunnels underneath Gaza, and it doesn't bear thinking about. It is harrowing.
Yeah, and we have the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, talking about a humanitarian corridor, which will be much needed, and we'll talk more about aid to Gaza, because we know those 20 trucks have managed to get through.
Yeah.
But we will move on. We'll move on to the Express now, because there's an interesting story on page 2, and this is about Brexit and deals with America, but not that overarching deal that we all were talking about. This is with individual states, according to the Express. This is quite curious.
The Express love to report all these Brexit benefits, don't they? All these huge Brexit deals that we're enjoying. But the way they report them, I always find the hyperbole is just insane. Yeah. It's like when that Indo-Pacific trade deal was done and we were told we were going to have 12 trillion or something, because they just added up the GDP of the countries and told us that's what we were going to get, which, I mean, that would be great, but that's just not true.
Okay.
So what we're talking about here is, as you say, do you remember when we were told, oh, we'll get a trade deal with the US, that would be easy. Now, that hasn't happened, and certainly Biden's got no interest in that for obvious reasons, certainly not right now, focusing on other things. But Kemi Badenoch has told us that she is thinking of signing up mini trade deals, if you like, with individual US states.
Shona, do you think this is the way forward then?
Well, I think a lot is revealed in the way the story is reported, because the first line is talking about 146 million Americans. You think that sounds like a lot of Americans, and then you read on and you're like, okay, 6 of the 50 states, maybe not as many as it seemed, and then you go a bit further down and there's talks underway about another 5, but it sounds a little bit desperate, sort of willingness to be a bit better than it is. And as you say, what are we to actually make of the use of the figures and the statistics here? And then you get a bit further down and you go Utah, Indiana, the Carolinas, Oklahoma. No offence to any of those states,
Absolutely.
but they perhaps aren't the places that everyone was thinking, wouldn't it be great to get a foothold in Oklahoma after Brexit? I don't know that anyone will be that excited once they get to the end of the story.
Oh, I know. We could talk about this forever, but we'll delve into the papers a little bit later at 7:30 with you both. But for now, thank you very much for that.